recording it again. I had some requests that people were looking for it, so I felt like it was rash to stop doing it, but I'm returning to that method. It is something that people, it's a resource if you miss class, so that's fine. Yeah, so we finished Aber Olsen last week. Now we have Iceland and Arctic Chill for our last 3 meetings. And then just on the business notes here, remember we have normal class today, Thursday, next Tuesday, but the following Thursday it's like a writing day to prepare your paper, and your papers are due on that Friday by midnight, Friday the 14th, I believe it is. Check it, because I did make a mistake on talking about this extra office hours. I said they were Wednesday the 6th, and that's the 5th, right? Tomorrow is I made a mistake, but it is the I can just check here on.
The final paper's due the 15th, right?
That's correct. Well, it's due at on the Saturday the 15th at 1 a.m. or something like that, or 12. Check very carefully on Catalyst so you don't make a mistake, because it's just the end of it's like midnight basically on the 14th. That was my thinking. And the reason is that I'll tell you, I have to be at these meetings out on the East Coast, and I'm going to try to correct all the papers right away on the plane trip back. And so I'm hoping that I think that if you get them into me then on time, I'll be able to get them all done and get your comments back to you, and you'll know your grade right away. Everyone likes that. So yeah, anyway, the 14th is a Friday. It's actually technically due at I think 12:01 a.m. on Saturday the 15th, but it's basically the end of the day on the 14th. Okay, so be aware of that. Number of people have made appointments with me to talk to me, but there's still people feel like they need to want to talk to me. You're certainly welcome to do that. You can drop by. It's not too busy, based on what I've seen so far, and. If you come by a little bit later in either my office hours or on tomorrow, Wednesday, in the 2:30 to 4:30 period, I will be there. And if someone's sitting there talking, I won't let your fellow students go on forever, but stick to business and make room for everyone who shows up. So please come by if you like. Okay, so that's that. And any other questions? Course-related stuff. Oh yeah.
So I was wondering when the last time you can set up individual appointments.
Well, I will be in my office hours next Tuesday, so you can come to talk to me next Tuesday, and so a week from today, and that is 3:30, 4:20. So that would be so a week from today in my post this class office hours. But I have to leave. I leave on the red-eye flight for New York that night, so I will be not in town after that. But you can certainly email me, and I'm not sure how much access I'll have to my email, but I'll be at a hotel where I'm sure I'll have email. So I will try to reply. If you have a question, don't hesitate to send it to me. I would just ask for your patience in my reply, because I might not be able to get to it very quickly. And then I'm just very busy with a bunch of other things too. So you're a priority for me, and I will do my best to respond as quickly and as thoroughly as I can. But if you hit me with a big request at the last minute, as I've said in the past, I just can't deal with that kind of stuff. If you want me to read your whole paper and give you suggestions for revisions on Friday night or something like that, that's kind of hard for me to do. So, or impossible for me to do. But I will, if you just give yourself 24 hours for me to respond, and then if you do it that way, you should be fine. So, but I just want to say again, it's a priority for me. It's funny. I've been thinking about emailing. I don't know people. I hope people don't feel frustrated or angry with me about my response to email, because I really, really try to reply as quickly as I can. And it's my new theory of things. I'll tell you a little personal anecdote. Right, I have 2 kids, and they go to Seattle Public Schools. And there's a new principal in their school, and she does not reply to email. Never replies to email. So my wife is a lawyer, and she's just when she wants an answer, she'll get an answer, right? And this person doesn't reply to her emails, and it drives her crazy. And I really think that email habits, you kind of people probably get way more email than I get, and I get 60 emails a day. But you just it's it's hard to deal with, but you got to find a way to like reply to people promptly and in a polite and constructive way. If what you're going to finish here, you're going to go on to work. I think that like you could go far if you just like replied to emails effectively, not like right away, but like within a couple hours. Because you don't want to be like the person that's just like one line right away, right? That's not helpful either. You got to kind of find your way to do it constructively, but. So I felt like I tried last quarter to do it, and it's a priority for me to try to do a better job at email. So if you ever have like a thing, like if you I'm certainly I find I learn a lot from student comments about that kind of thing. So if you find that you have some advice for me, I'd be happy to hear it. You can tell me in my office hours or email it to me. But it's an important thing, and if you don't do it, people notice and they get frustrated quickly. So I don't want like a boiling frustration. That jerk doesn't answer everyone's like gossiping. Oh, did he answer your email? No, he didn't answer my email. Did he answer yours? No. So that's anyway. Enough of that. It's an important thing, isn't it? Those kinds of forms of communication. Yeah. Oh, one other thing that came up that I got some questions about from a couple people via email, and someone raised it in class too, or in talking to me after class. Was, let's say you want to do the revision, or you're not sure, am I revising my paper or am I doing a different paper? For what I mean by a revision is if you're reusing material from your previous paper. That's the kind of the criterion that matters. If you're reusing material but revising it, right, then you have a revision paper. And you'd be obviously adding stuff from the last two novels to the paper. However, if you can start from scratch on a question from the final prompts, and the final prompts kind of overlap a little bit, obviously with the midterm prompts. And you may have ideas from your previous paper, but want to kind of take it in a different direction, and you can certainly do that. And that would not be a revision. For those people who are doing revision, I would like you to, I'll send out an email about this too, but I'll tell you right now so you remember. So write it down if you're doing a revision. The metadata for your paper, your name, you don't have to put your student number. All you really need is your name, but you can put your student number in there if you want to. And then, you put the title in the middle, the paper criteria. Remember, don't forget a title is required. And prompt 2 is not a good title. I'll just mention as an aside. But anyway, put a title in there. The title is in the middle, right? But the metadata is that on the left or the right where it's your name. You can put your student number, the date, whatever. The course, actually, it's helpful for me to know, so I'd make sure that's right. Course, Scan 315 or JSIS 317. Put revision option if you're revising your paper. Okay, so then I can just see it right at the top. And now the other thing is that needs to go in that metadata for some people is W credit. I can tell usually that it's a longer paper, but it's really helpful to me to get that W. You need to have that there so that I know that's why the paper is longer. And then when I'm calculating the grades, then I can double check and make sure you're getting the W credit, because I have to check off an extra box in the grade form to give you that W credit. So if you are doing the W credit, make sure you put that in that metadata column. And also then, if you're doing a revision, I'd like you to put revision option in there too. So I'll remind people about that by email, but just in case, please, there's another reminder now. Any other questions about kind of coming to the end of the course here? Okay, good. So today we turn to Arctic chill and Iceland. So before I start talking about Iceland, I want to ask you a question. Does the Scandinavian in Scandinavian crime fiction matter? And what might that question mean? Does the context matter? Does it matter to understand something about Iceland or something about Norway when we read The Water's Edge, or something about Finland when you read Copperheart? Or does that context doesn't matter at all? You can read it without it. Gabrielle?
I feel like you could read it without it, but it's like things make a lot more sense. Like there are things that are a little bit more eye-opening.
Okay.
If you have some of the background.
So it's like I'll just put this here. some of these notes. Okay, so does scanning matter for novels? And it's like context enriches reading. I think, is that what you're saying? That it adds some layers there that allow you to see and understand things that you would miss if you didn't have that context. And so maybe we could say it deepens your understanding of the novel a little bit. Bailey, I think you had your hand up back there.
Yeah, one of the issues with videos, we talked about like social criticism. The last book that we started talking about Denmark issues with immigration, and then being able to see the motivations to how Assad is portrayed.
Okay, so you could. This is actually a good point that Bailey's making too. It's a little bit different than just saying context, because you could say it's historicist, right? So one thing you can, like one good college takeaway, or this is maybe more like almost like a graduate school thing, is the difference between historical and historicist. Historical thinking, you could say, is where you say there's an overarching story to history, right? There's a kind of a pattern that is being followed. So one of the most famous stories of those is the Marxist story, right? That the history of human society is a history of conflict between classes that's moving toward a revolution, right? And some people say we live in a post-historical society. What does that mean? That old Marxist story doesn't really make sense anymore. It seems like it doesn't. That history shows something different, right? That's historical thinking. Historicist thinking is kind of like a one damn thing after another argument, where there's all these things that are going on that attract a lot of attention and become the issues of the day, and novels and films try to tie into them, right? And they try to and you could say on the one hand, they reflect those conflicts. That is, they are a mirror to them, right? They show what's going on in the society. Alternatively, you could say they try to intervene in them. They make the conflicts, right? So, I don't know what's a good example. Michael Moore, Fahrenheit 9/11. Remember that one? You could say it's a reflection of the political moment when, Iraq War, Bush, whatever, Bush 2. Or you could say it's an intervention, right? He's trying to change the way the system is working by making that film. That's a historicist film, right? It's not in the sense that it's tied into a topical moment. So Bailey's argument, right, is that the figure of Assad is a kind of there's a historicist aspect to that novel because we're involved in issues and debates about immigration in Denmark through the novel. So context is kind of like the whole terrain. We understand something about Denmark and can see some things that we wouldn't see otherwise. And historicist is there's this one particular thing that's an issue in the society, and the novel is tied into it. So we can do both things, right? And we try to do both things, context and sort of a little bit of a historicist thing. So, for example, we don't see it so clearly here, but one of the important historicist issues for Iceland, or topical issues would be a way of talking about it for today, right? It's in the news all the time, is the Icelandic financial crisis. Similar to ours in the United States, only far more devastating. We'll talk about that in a bit. Schwan, you had a point.
Sometimes if you don't know the background of what the setting is, it can be really irritating.
Okay.
And what I've noticed with the majority of these books, the beginning is kind of slow.
Yeah.
And it's kind of characteristic of Scandinavian crime novels.
Yeah.
And so without knowing that, you might just
skip it. Put it down. Yeah. So no knowledge can cause irritation, right? Where one way of thinking about reading in general is that there's a kind of a fancy term that people have used over the years, since the last 40 years maybe, called the horizon of expectations, right? Which is from a certain kind of literary criticism. And a horizon of expectations is sort of like what not only you could expect, but what makes sense within a given novel, say. And in a way, it's a way of talking about what interpretations matter. So we take like Arctic Chill, and we can say it's a novel about children again, say for example, and make arguments about that. And we would maybe agree or disagree with the specificities of the different arguments, but we could generally agree that within that horizon of expectations, it's a novel about children. We could talk about Andreessen and what he's done and so forth. But we would say this is not a cookie recipe, right? That's outside the horizon of expectations. It's some kind of literature, popular literature, and it's kind of outside. So that there's this horizon of expectations, but if you come at this, just pick it up, and you know nothing about Iceland, nothing about Andreessen, nothing about what it is, you have no horizon of expectations. You can't figure it out. You got to kind of spend that time figuring it out a little bit or whatever. So, I mean, obviously the publisher does something to set that up with blurbs, and then you could just Google the title these days, right, and then you would hit Amazon and see what readers have said and so forth. There's lots of really convenient ways now to set yourself up to understand a little bit more and get that horizon of expectations. But if you don't have it, it can be very troubling. So, or irritating. So one way filling in is a good way to give a little background. I hope it sort of gives a shortcut to these kinds of things. Yeah, Hannah.
I was going to say it helps us understand how their government is different, and even, like, especially in the crime fiction novels, it helps us understand how they deal with their criminals.
Okay, yeah, comparative differences, right? That we can see, we can sort of measure it against the U.S. And we can see in that way some social differences, differences in attitude, governmental differences, like Hannah mentioned. And that's actually, it's one of the reasons to read, right? I mean, that's why, one of the main reasons you read is to learn about different kinds of things, experiences you haven't had, right? And, you know, I mean, people maybe remember you had a friend, like in grade school or something like that, who would, like, pass off things they read in books as their own experiences, right? I mean, there's this kind of fascination, or maybe you were the one that did it, huh? I never did that. Right, but we, like, you get fascinated with something and you kind of, like, want to talk about it, and that's why we read, right? Of course, as an adult reader, you have to understand it more, not as a kind of a absorbing these other things, but, you know, you're kind of bouncing yourself off that and thinking about it and spending time in the world of a novel and so forth. And it's those comparative differences that Hannah's pointed to, where we see the way a different government works, or a different set of assumptions, different kinds of expectations, different problems, right? And that could be very important. I mean, at bottom, the argument there, right, is that you confront something different than yourself, and in doing that, there's a kind of an ethical issue that you face. Who is this other? Why should I care about him or her? And in asking those questions, right, that's a fundamental question of a modern society. What's your relationship to the people sitting in the same row as you are? You know, what's your relationship to other students at the UW? What's your relationship to other people in Seattle? You may know very little about their lives, or you may have some ideas about their lives. But what's your relationship to people of a different regional identity, or ethnic identity, or sexual identity, or a different age? You know, like retired people, whatever. So thinking about those things, reading is a way to entertain those questions through a novel, right? And that's a version of what Hannah points to as well. There's those comparative differences that we can experience through reading. And so if we enrich that by contextualizing, we get a better sense of those ethical questions. Agnes.
I certainly agree with everything else on there, and I can relate to it, especially because I'm not from the area, and so I can really absorb that. But
what, you mean from Iceland or from...
for any of the Scandinavian
Okay,
countries,
okay.
I'm not familiar with
Okay.
it. But at the same time, from a critical point of view, I feel that sometimes that aspect does not matter as
Okay.
much because of the genre. Because in the end, I feel that the point of the crime novels has to do with the whodunit, the thriller, and just figuring out who the murderer is, and just kind of solving the problem, the crime problems, which is a universal thing. Like, it's just someone died, and you're trying to figure the scene out.
Yeah. Great point. I'm glad you kind of pushed back a little bit against the direction of the conversation, because, of course, that is one of the things about genre fiction. No matter where it comes from, in a way, we recognize the structures, and even if you don't get the sort of the culture, you don't need to get the culture, one could argue, because we recognize the narrative structures. Right? And, of course, this is like in popular culture, this is very common. You don't need it in a way. anyone, I don't know if anyone's a student of film or has watched films, Hollywood films from say the 30s or 40s or 50s, the kind of the studio era. Oftentimes there are, a good example, Dracula from 1932. In the film, they go to Transylvania. That's where the film is set. And you go there, and they're like and they go into this inn on the way up to the thing. You can see it's like the hills around L.A. or whatever. And they stop at this inn, and then there's the local Romanians, right? They're like talking like crazy pigeon talk, just invented, right? It's Hollywood's version of the ethnic other, right? Just reduced to some crazy language I don't understand, right? But that doesn't matter for the genre, right? It's not about ethnographic kind of accuracy. It's just those other people, right? Which is, of course, a problem in a big way. But on the other hand, it tells you about the genre and the kind of point Agnes is making. Genre can do that. It distracts us because it has such a strong pull in one direction. So genre minimizes difference. Anyway, these are some different ways to think about it. I just wanted to remind ourselves why it's worth, or why not we can look at these things in figuring out stuff. So I think we can see that there's good reason to pay attention to context, but also a good novel, a good detective novel, a crime novel should also not depend on our deep understanding of context. And this goes back to Shuan's point. Again, it's one of the things about Scandinavian crime fiction is that they start slow, right? This novel actually is an exception. It kind of picks up right from the start and puts us into it versus, Stieg Larsson winding up for 200 pages before he gets going. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Iceland then here, and we'll try to keep it brief, and then we'll turn to the novel itself. And so what I'd like to do is we'll talk a little bit about Iceland and then ask what does the context matter for this novel based on how you've read it so far and our keyword. So anyone been to Iceland? It's easy to go there now because Iceland Air is one of the cheapest it's the cheapest ticket to Europe from Seattle. And you can and they stop in Reykjavik, right, the capital, or stop in Keflavik, which is the airport, a little bit outside of Reykjavik, and you can get a layover for free. And Iceland was, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was like a really hot place to go, big party city and so forth. And very expensive, but very fashionable. And it's got this kind of ultra modern. There's been lots of, if you look up Iceland in the New York Times or various travel magazines, there's been lots of writing about Iceland over the years, or the last 10, 15 years, because of it's this sort of party city. But and then it's a great natural beauty. There's no trees in Iceland, for example. They cut them all down around the year 1000, and there's been no trees since. So it's like a moon. People say it's like a moonscape. It's very weird that way. And Icelanders are, they're kind of what are the stereotypes? I don't know. It's like a barren island where people had, as you see here, this Arctic chill, right? It's cold and dreary weather, and people are kind of tough people from the plains, sort of. They're survivors, having lived up there, and so it's a very kind of independent place. There's a famous author from Iceland named Halldór Laxness. He wrote he won the Nobel Prize, I think, in the 1935 or 36 or something like that. And his most famous novel is Independent People, is the title, about some sheep farmers out in the middle of Iceland. Write a novel about that, and then you'll show you really got the chops, huh? Yeah. So, and then of course the most famous Icelandic literature is the sagas that go back that were written down anonymously between 1100 and 1200, but they take place in the Viking Age, so from about 800 to 1000, and tell about what the Vikings did, basically, and what society was like in Iceland. So there's different kinds of sagas. There's sagas about what happened in Iceland. There's Viking sagas where they're out talking about what the Vikings did, and then there's sagas about the Norwegian kings and kind of the royal succession stories that led to the settlement of Iceland, because it was Iceland was settled by Norwegian and Danish sailors, basically, who went west and set up new homes in Iceland. What other things do people know about Iceland before I give you my kind of little nutshell here? Kaya. Small population. Anyone know the population of Iceland? Yeah, 330, I think, is what the figure that you hear. So Seattle, the greater Puget Sound, right, is like 2.5 million. I think Seattle's 800,000. So it's like not even half of Seattle. The entire country. It's a very, very small country. And like you see a little bit here, you may think, how come they never talk about anyone's last names? Right? They don't use last names in Iceland. They have patronyms, right? So you go by the Icelanders I've known over the years, like Bjarni Ingason, right? Inga's son, Bjarni Inga's son, right? That his father's name was Inga. You don't have like a last name that you pass down. You have your first name. So that if you ask an Icelander, like, do you know someone? You ask, do you know Bjarni? Oh, which Bjarni? And then you like figure it out together. But it would mean nothing to say Bjarni Ingason. You could use that as a little more context, because like patronyms and matrilineal names that so Ingason and Vilma's daughter or whatever. Of course, there are other exceptions and people who have kind of special last names of one kind or another. But for the most part, it's this kind of very small society and extraordinary familiarity that you see in the language. Yeah, Bailey. Right, so it's like, I think it's about 200,000 that live in Reykjavik, and then the rest of the population is scattered. There's some smaller cities in the west, and then in the north that are mostly like fishing places, basically, and then farmers out there, so forth. Now, one thing, actually, if you want to, if you're interested in Iceland at all, or this novel made you interested, Iceland is for many reasons, fascinating. For example, one of the big things in Iceland in the last 15, 20 years has been aluminum smelting, because they have, one of the resources that they have is hydropower. Big rivers in this huge land, right? Because there's mountains, as you may know, mountainous glaciers and so forth, so big runoff, big rivers. And there's a film called, I think it's called The Ice, I have to recall the title. I can't recall the title right now. Documentary, I know it's in the library, about how aluminum smelting came to Iceland. And it's basically a corporate story about how, using tax advantages for big companies like Alcoa, they were able to attract them close to these reserves. And it was a way of trying to build employment in these outlying areas. But of course, the thing with aluminum smelting is it has a huge environmental impact. And they had to they built all these built new dams to serve the aluminum industry that many people opposed for environmental reasons, because they felt like for example, they flooded one of the main bird sanctuaries in the country as a result of this, one of the main dams they built. And so you can imagine the kinds of debates: the environmental lobby versus the business lobby. And so these were things that have been very, very controversial. But it's a very interesting place that way. One of the things that people say about Iceland as well is that that maybe history bears out to some degree, is that Iceland is like the Italy of Scandinavia. That means what they mean by that is they're vital and love life and party and have a good time in an Icelandic way. Not like it's Italy, right? You sit on the piazza and drink a glass of wine, and in Iceland they like come stay around the bars, at like 2 a.m. It's like a binge culture. But that binging, like they live it up right now, and we'll worry about things tomorrow. And people say part of the reason for that is it's like a fishing culture. And if the nets are full, let's have a good time. If they're not, we just got to keep going until the next time. And then you live it up when you got it. So that's something that is arguably a part of the Icelandic mentality. Other things, Ben?
Don't they have good job opportunities that attracts a lot of attention, or was that just the book?
No, that's true. That's true. And that's part of that is, like, for example, like this aluminum stuff. Tons of migrant labor came in to help build it, right? Because they don't have enough it's such a tiny population. When you undertake a huge project like that to build a big dam, right, you need labor power. And so there's lots of economic migration to Iceland. The other thing is, it's a tiny little place, and in a kind of globalized world, those sorts of job opportunities in niche areas and so forth, they've been trying to recruit people to come up there to work in order to facilitate economic growth. So it's certainly, you can imagine a place like, you get the novels about this, right? Where you have this, I mean, it's not called Arctic chill by accident. This place that is frozen up there, and then all these people that come from around the world who have little experience with that kind of world, what happens when those forces collide? So lots. If I understand right, there's lots. It's like the usual kind of migration that's been there. Lots of people who've come to work in niche industries like plumbing, for example, or in the fishing industry, people coming to work in canning and that kind of thing. In factories where they have way higher wages than they could ever earn at home, but then you got to live in Iceland. So, Emily.
Gender equality is highly valued there.
Yeah, another Scandinavian welfare state where high levels of gender equity, high levels of equality across the board, these kinds of things are important, and again, part of the system. You could call it, like, one thing we didn't talk about, but the correct term for that, also state feminism, where the state has taken a role in trying to enact what you could call a feminist agenda, that is, act in certain areas of the society to increase gender equity, and it's had a big impact on Iceland since female prime minister, these kinds of things. But Vigdis Fogardottir, I think, so about 15 years ago. So another instance of high levels of gender equity. Yeah.
Wasn't there the volcano there?
Right. Yeah, that's right. So I think, what was it? I'm trying to remember the name. I learned how to pronounce the mountain. I can't speak Icelandic, but I learned how to pronounce the mountain Eyjafjallajökull or something like that, which was like, so say it and you get an A. That was the one that blew up and stopped everything, all the jet travel for a couple weeks in 2009. The other thing is the Icelanders say they caused the French Revolution because a similar kind of volcanic event happened in like 1787, and the cloud, that historians argue, heavily impacted agricultural production in continental Europe in the year and a half following that volcanic event. And so with poor agricultural production in continental Europe, the stage was set for political conflict that exploded in the French Revolution. So this is a joke that Icelanders make, that they caused the French Revolution. So despite its tiny size, it has had an impact. The other thing is the Vikings. People who have taken the Vikings course here on campus, taught by the Scandinavian historian in our department, Terry Laren, popular course. And so you can study the Vikings in great detail if you like. But the Vikings are, they're famous because it was a pagan system, right? That in Roman Europe, and so the Vikings sailed around Europe and took over the UK, the northern part of the UK, and established all these kinds of practices that have had a big impact on Western history, you could say. For example, one of the main heritages of the Viking system was the jury trial. The sagas are like legal documents in a weird way, where when you read them, they're often about legal conflicts and the resolution of legal conflicts. So in this pagan system, there was if you killed someone, it was not a moral sin. You just had to make up you had to make things right economically. So you paid blood money to even the score if you killed someone in some accident or fight, right? But there wasn't the kind of moral or legal condemnation of murder that we think of. Although people recognize the dangers of murder, many of the sagas are like feuds, ongoing over generations about what happened. Anyway, so what they would do is they would get together, the local farmers, and they would come to a kind of decision in this, what they called the thing, about what to do in these various sorts of legal situations. And then it was the all thing, where the whole country got together, all these certain people of the high class got together and talked about legal matters and read the law book and read the laws and so forth. So that there was this kind of, recited the laws, so that there was these various ways in which the law was very important, and that kind of trial by jury comes from that Icelandic system. So Icelanders, for that reason, are very proud of their Viking history. The one thing that I think is relevant for this novel, too, is the immigration history that Emily brought up that we see here, but also the economic history. Anyone know what happened with the Icelandic economy in 2008? You can go, there's been lots of reporting on it in the United States. There was a very good article in it, if you want to get a good kind of narrative account, in the New Yorker magazine in probably spring of 2009. But Iceland had really fast economic growth in the 1990s and 2000s, in part because of deregulations of their economy. And what happened was there were 3 banks that got really big really fast. And they had banking operations in the Netherlands, in the UK, other parts of Denmark, other parts of Northern Europe. And what they were doing was they were making trades against the Icelandic currency where they could make huge amounts of money by speculating on currency. So they would take in deposits, right, or investments, handle investments, whatever. So bring in money and then do all kinds of speculation, and they could pay very high rates of interest to depositors and to borrowers of various kinds, or give very low rates of interest depending on, if they were giving out loans or taking in deposits. And so they were making tons and tons of money, right, on a speculative speculative way. You could say, actually, as one Icelander remarked to me at the time, Iceland is a big floating hedge fund, which means what a hedge fund does is takes in money that it's essentially borrowing from depositors or investors, and then it does speculative kinds of invests or tries to make money on money it's borrowed, and then pays back high rates of interest. So that's what these Icelandic banks were doing. But then, as things started to look bad, right, 07, 08, slowing growth, and then the big mortgage securitization catastrophe in 2008, Lehman Brothers, and etc. These Icelandic banks, economic growth stops. How are they going to pay back all these loans, right? There's all these depositors in the UK who are getting 4% interest on their savings account, but they have £100,000 in there. What do you do with these people, right? Or the Netherlands. And so all these banks, there was a run on these banks in the Netherlands and the UK, people trying to get their money out in time before they locked the doors. So huge problems. Iceland, the total debt of the Icelandic economy, I read, was like around $15 billion at that point, which was like 10 times the size of the Icelandic economy. So who's going to pay all that money out? Who's going to pay that money? Icelandic taxpayers? You can imagine how they felt if they weren't the ones doing all this speculation. They weren't the ones making the money off it. But they were suddenly looking like they were on the hook. All those banks went into receivership, taken over by the government, and the IMF came in. It was the biggest economic crisis per capita basis in the history of modern economies. And they actually, instead of sort of cutting the public sector, they raised taxes and put in all kinds of government controls over investments. And they've been able to basically rebuild the economy so that unemployment has gone back down and there's like small economic growth now. So they've kind of gotten over the worst of it. But there's a big debate now in Iceland about what next, because all those controls people see as a block to any kind of investment, whether by Icelanders or foreigners. And so the question is, how do we protect our economy and move forward? And that's the crisis now. But you can imagine that the kinds of issues that arose around that. If you want to read a kind of an interesting take on that, there's a novel called Jar City by the same author here. It's like 2000, and one of the big companies that rose on that whole speculative bubble was a company called Decode Genetics, which is sort of an interesting story. Decode Genetics is a biotech company that was, it now belongs to Merck, but it was an Icelandic professor, actually, at the University of Iceland who founded it, grew up, and it was based on the Icelandic genetic heritage, you could say. And what they had done was they got pushed through all these laws of implied consent. So if you ever went to the doctor and had a blood sample or whatever, and you were an Icelander, implied consent meant that information went into a national database. And they were able to construct this sort of genetic heritage of the Icelandic people. And the idea then is that you can identify all these kinds of genetic markers and do drug design and genetic medicine that will, because they had such a large amount of data, they could be really competitive in doing drug design and doing various forms of gene therapy that other people doing the same kind of thing couldn't do. They just had more information and a better record than anyone else. Well, Decode rose and then fell, so it was like, I think when they had their initial public offer in Iceland, it was like people were buying the stuff at like $90 a share or something like that, and now it went down to like a penny stock and then finally got sold to Merck. So all these Icelanders lost all this money on Decode. But it was kind of a sign of the times, biotech, Iceland, this banking stuff that turned out bust. But it was a very interesting it's a very interesting kind of project. And this, Indridason was very alert to it, and his first novel, first crime novel, Jar City, is about, it's a kind of a roman à clef, right, about decode genetics and about these things. And what is it? To really find out what's back there, It's more complicated, of course, than just figuring out gene therapy, right, where there are, where the things have happened in the past that we don't know about, but can be made evident through genetic detection. It's a good read and a very bleak novel. But anyway, so there's more about Iceland. I think is there any questions or points about Iceland that haven't come up? Very famous for Bjork, for example.
Why do they still use the Old Norse language?
They don't use Old Norse. They use modern Icelandic, which it's kind of like Italian to Latin, where there's many, many similarities and connections, but you can't just... And so if you're sort of like someone who's taken the time to study Old Norse a little bit and you're a speaker of modern Icelandic, no problem to read Old Norse, but you would have to do a little bit of work, but it's kind of, the modern language with modernized grammar and so forth. So some of the irregularities eliminated and that kind of thing. But one thing about Iceland, you see a little bit here, even in the translation, Icelanders are very protective of their language, and so there's an office of the Icelandic language that says if a word can come in or not, and they've tried to keep out all kinds of loan words. So I don't know, like many languages, they have like some kind of English slang for the movies, but in English or in Iceland it's like kvikmyndir, which is like quick pictures. Where they do all these, they try to like Icelandicize everything, so there's not loan words being brought in, but various forms of Icelandic invented. So in our novel, Sigurdur Óli, this assistant, and Erlender's like a man of the past, locked in the past, and kind of committed to some kind of idea of Icelandic heritage in a way, whereas this guy, Sigurdur Óli, I think it says at one point, he went to school in the United States, and he drops all this English into his language. And so it's kind of old versus new linguistically because of the slang that he uses, which some Icelanders feel like, oh, well, we need to protect Icelandic from other languages because we're so small that we'll just get swamped if we start taking too much in. So the debate in this novel about immigration, you can see it's almost like language is an analog to that. What do we do about the lines? Where do we draw the lines? So we'll take a break in a second here, but I want to just ask you one question here before we do that. And we'll just go back to the question of context at the beginning. It's already come up, I think, in Emily's point, but I'll just ask it as an open-ended question, and we'll take just a couple minutes to discuss it here at the end. Just begin by talking about people sitting next to you, and then we can talk about it as a class. And that is, how does context matter for this novel? How does context matter for this novel? So take a few minutes to talk about that, and then we can talk about it as a class. Okay, before we take a break, let's hear what you thought. I'm just thinking about reading the first part of the novel here. How does context matter for this novel? Tommy.
Just reading for this discussion, I thought it was weird how when the boy who was murdered was tied, they instantly assumed that racism was involved.
Okay.
From here, that's not the first assumption people make on minorities.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's a great place to start. We can talk about this. When you think about the way in which we think about race in the United States, in our society is very multicultural, right? Multi-ethnic. We would have a different set of assumptions probably in the U.S. And so we see, it maybe goes to Hannah's point a little bit too, that the way there's these comparative differences. And so why, different attitudes toward race, ethnicity. Good place to start. Other thoughts people had? Casey? Yeah, Iceland is a really homogeneous place. I mean, it's like totally off the beaten track, and immigration is quite recent. So it's and in fact it was very just amazing stories about these kinds of islands. I'm just going to tell you a story that to me is like one of the crazy but really powerful story about Iceland. It doesn't reflect very well on Iceland, but from World War II and an American connection about race. And you can hear this story on the radio program, This American Life. You'd have to go in the archives and try to figure it out. But I remember it very well because I thought it was just such an amazing story. Of course, in the United States, in the armed services during World War II, Jim Crow was in force, right? And so there was segregation among servicemen and different kinds of units and so forth, right? And in the U.S. Navy, there was all kinds of traffic along the East Coast, both going up through the North Atlantic, supply routes and so forth, that the Germans were trying to attack all the time, right? And so this was a story about this particular story was about an African American serviceman from like Macon, Georgia, right? And who in his particular ship was like a frigate that was part of these supply chain things. The African American soldiers on that ship were told you were not allowed to disembark, and that was because the Icelanders said we don't want any American soldiers and no African Americans, leaving their ships in our country. Right? This is homogeneity they're trying to protect. And there's more to the story. I'll tell it in a little bit. And so, but this guy, so of course their boat got hit, right? And so imagine that conflict, right? There you are, your boat is going down, and they can see the land from the ship. Now, you're going to die if you stick to the ship, right? It's burning, it's sinking, whatever. But what is going to happen to you when Jim Crow from Georgia if you go ashore and you know you're not supposed to go ashore. It's like rock in a hard place, right? So this guy went ashore and he was like rescued by the locals, and he was like, they're gonna lynch me, right? And it was actually not Iceland but Newfoundland, and it's the most amazing story because they were like they had never seen an African American person before, and he was like covered in oil because of this shipwreck. So they washed the oil off, but then they kept trying to wash him off because they'd never seen dark skin. Anyway, but they took him in and like nursed the guy back to health, and it was sort of an amazing story the way that he tells it because it was like the first time that he had this kind of experience of sort of race not in a way being totally in the foreground, in another way a kind of a contact where they nursed him back to health and he survived and made it back home and whatever. And so this guy actually became some kind of, I can't remember if he was successful or what, but he saved a bunch of money and then he gave some of that money in his will to this little town in Newfoundland, way off the beaten track, to build a playground there when he died. So it's kind of an interesting story about race and the North Atlantic and these kinds of things. But part of it doesn't reflect very well on Iceland, right? Because what was their attitude toward homogeneity of their population? Because of that World War II experience and the strategic importance of Iceland in the North Atlantic, it's like also a big floating air base or aircraft carrier. There was an important American air base there in the post-war period, NATO air base, that was seen as strategically important to defense against the Soviet Union. But the Icelanders walled the whole thing off and wouldn't let it. There was very strict restrictions about how American soldiers could interact with the local population. Actually, Andreessen has written about this topic as well. Amazing novel called The Silence of the Grave that is about Icelandic heritage and American soldiers and kind of this cross and this inter-ethnic love and whatever. It's a very good novel and talks about this history. But that's one where you can see that the point that Casey put her finger on about Icelandic homogeneity is one worth paying attention to, and I think that's one of the reasons I chose this novel is because I think it does maybe a more thoughtful job in some ways than UC Adler-Olsen in thinking about immigration and ethnic difference in the Nordic countries today, where these countries have thought of themselves as fairly homogeneous and off the main course of sort of European interethnic kind of mixing. Even there, and of course Europe itself has these ethnic nations themselves have notions of homogeneous identities that differ from what we think of as, for example, American multicultural identities. You could be an American citizen no matter where you're from, right? Blood is not important. Whereas you can't be a Finn, you can't be an Icelander unless you're born there to Finnish or Icelandic parents. It's blood, right? Other thoughts for context before we take a break? Final points. All right, let's take a break and we'll start at 25-2. Hey, Gabrielle.
I had two questions.
Okay.
I was wondering if you got the email link for the...
I did get it, yes, thank you.
Cool.
I
I'm
sure
just double
did.
checking to make sure it didn't
Yep.
go to a junk folder.
You got it.
And then the second question
I have not done it yet, but was there a deadline, or I didn't actually
but it's
read
not
through it all?
for a little while now. It's
Okay.
late March
Okay,
or
great.
something like that.
Great. Thanks for being organized and getting it to me
Yeah, and
fairly
then
early.
my midterm score was never posted.
Oh.
I'm sure
it's
off the
probably
top of
because
your
it's
head
sitting
you
on my desk and I didn't grade it. Could be a reason. Thank you for reminding me about that. I will. There's two more that I need to grade, and I will look at yours, but I don't think I probably graded it. I know exactly where it is, but probably ungraded. So thank you for reminding me about that. I will get that taken care of.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great.
Awesome. That was
Okay.
my questions.
Great. Hey. I do have some. Yeah, let me look at my calendar here.
So I didn't know if you received my email or not.
Oh, did I? Oh, thank you. After my little riff on email there, it turns out I didn't reply to yours. Let's see here.